What's going on, fellow Maplers? Today, we've got a pretty heated topic. A topic so controversial, it's resulted in Korean Reboot players renting a literal truck with signs protesting the changes that have already occurred in KMS and are anticipated to come to GMS in the next few months. That's right, I'm talking about the Reboot nerfs as a part of the New Age update. I can hear the gasps now. Earth-shattering, world-ending stuff. Seriously though, it's a game. If you are genuinely outraged over this, just relax a little bit. This video will go through the changes to come, what this means at each level of progression, some thoughts on Nexon's decision, and how they might improve the player experience instead of continually eroding it. Alright, so what's the hubbub all about? Reboot will be reverting the HP and experience of mobs back in line with the regular server, while simultaneously reverting the level difference final damage multipliers. I'm using the Orange Mushroom translated patch notes for this information, and as far as I know, these are the only changes that have occurred thus far. From my understanding, all other Reboot differences have remained untouched at this time. So, what does this mean in terms of your progression? I think the best way to look at this is by level ranges. I'll start at the bottom and work my way up. First off, whether you are still working towards 8K or higher Legion, or like to try out new characters, many of you will be impacted by the changes to leveling from 1 to 200. I've put together a simple table which shows the monster level, the HP, and the XP multiplier at Reboot, as well as the percent change when shifting from Reboot to normal server monster EXP. At first, this looks really bad, and it is, but not necessarily in terms of XP rates at all levels. Levels 1 to 100 look like they're getting the shaft, but I think it's mostly net neutral. All the monsters are taking a pretty heavy hit to XP rates, however, during 1 to 30, it's not much different and you spend so little time there. 30 to 50 can be offset by party quests, which have the same XP rewards, and 50 to 100 will be influenced by the level difference final damage. Let me explain how the level difference works. In Reboot, every level up to 10 levels higher than the monster you are fighting gives you 2% final damage for a total of 20%. Every level lower reduces your final damage until you can no longer hit the mob at 20 levels lower than it. In regular servers, this scale is much more lenient. You get the max final damage bonus at 5 levels higher than the mob you are currently fighting, and the lower level penalties are spread out over twice as many levels. You can no longer hit a mob at 40 levels lower than it. On top of this reduced penalty, the mob HP levels are getting significantly reduced. This means that you can kill the mobs you would normally be fighting much earlier and in one hit, which gives better scaled XP in each level range. For example, instead of heading to Copper Drakes around level 60, you can now achieve similar damage in the low 50s. So instead of killing something like Wild Boars per the Maple Guide, which give 355 experience in Reboot, you're killing Drakes at the same point, which give 302 experience on the regular server. This is about a 15% reduced XP rate, rather than the 50 to 60% that it looks like on paper. There's so many combinations of mobs you can look at. Kill speed impact is impossible to assess because it's dependent on your account progression, but in summary, this level range might end up being slightly slower, but not too significant. However, from level 100 to 200, the progression path starts to change in a much more impactful way due to the competitive rates of Starforce maps. The XP buffs to Reboot make regular monsters much more viable, but don't drastically change Starforce monsters. Starforce monsters are actually still better, but many people forego training on them because of the interruption to buffs and training in order to Starforce your gear, and how quickly Starforce requirements seem to outscale equipment you have easy access to. This change essentially forces players to only train on Starforce maps. I'll look at a level 180 Starforce monster, the Grey Luxury Saucer, versus a level 180 normal monster, the Burning Vanity, to further explain. I've chosen these monsters because the highest Starforce monster is level 180, and the gap between normal and Starforce mobs remains fairly similar as you progress up to this point. The Grey Luxury Saucer gives about 99,000 base experience in Reboot and 83,000 base experience in the regular server. The Burning Vanity gives about 75,000 base experience in Reboot and 27,500 experience in the regular server. You can see a normal mob gives about 25% less experience than Starforce mobs on Reboot, and about 67% less on the regular server. Base XP of a mob is incredibly important because it scales with all of your buffs. I'll show you how this shakes out between all the mobs, and I've rounded the numbers to make it much easier to look at. So, the Burning Vanity gives 75,000 base XP. Let's say you can get 100% Burning and 150% bonus XP in buffs, which is just a 2x card and MVP. This combination gets you 75,000 base XP, plus 75,000 Burning XP, plus 112,000 buff XP, for a total of 262,000 XP per mob. The Grey Luxury Saucer gives 100,000 base XP, so applying the same buffs, you get about 350,000 XP total. Same story, just applied. The normal mobs give 25% less XP, which contributes to the increasing gap in final XP. As the scaling currently works in Reboot, after a few levels beyond 180, you are encouraged to switch back to normal mobs as they start to outscale the XP rates of Starforce maps. But all the way up until level 180, Starforce maps offer premium XP rates. Even when reverting to normal server rates of the Grey Luxury Saucer, which gives 83,000 base XP, we still get 290,000 total XP per mob. This is still better than buffed normal mobs in Reboot by about 10%. So also worth noting, I lowballed the XP buffs. You can push way higher than 150% bonus XP with Rune Uptime, Link, Legion, Hyper, Event, and XP potions. Maybe this offsets not being able to find 100% Burning, but just imagine that the difference in base XP will just widen the gap of your final XP the more buffs you have. Even with the nerfs, you are still getting comparable rates in theory. I'm very specifically saying in theory because it won't work that way in practice, but I'll address that in a second. Now let's look at the XP of the Burning Vanity on regular servers. You get 28,000 base XP, which is abysmal. I mean, hot damn. The Starforce maps are nearly 3 times better than the normal mobs on regular servers. Even if normal mobs continue to scale, it's not fast enough to compensate for the difference between the two types of mobs at regular server rates. This will naturally push players onto Starforce maps. Technically, you could still do normal mobs, but this gap is just way too large to justify that for most players. Almost everyone will choose to seek out Starforce maps, which is the meta in regular servers. This creates a whole new set of issues on Reboot. The main problem, and one that is actually very detrimental to the player experience with Starforce maps, is that there is an extremely limited amount of them. Currently, at each level range, there are several options for which monsters you can clear in Reboot. The guide usually suggests 3, and then there are variants for those because Nexon likes to reskin the same monster, and then there are Starforce maps, and then there are monsters off the guide in the same level range, which all give nearly identical XP. The key takeaway? You have options and variety. More choice is almost always better for players. It encourages people to explore new areas, makes the MapleStory world appear larger, the monster collection log doesn't feel like a waste of time for trying out new mobs, and most importantly, it offers variety in the gameplay loop when you work on new characters. If you only had to do this on one character, I don't think it would be an issue, but training 100 to 200 is a massive part of the game because of the Legion system. If you play this game in the long term, you will be experiencing this same exact grind on at least 42 characters. That sounds miserable. Not only that, but having more options means you can always find a map with high burning, which may have slightly worse layout, but makes it competitive with popular maps, even on servers as populated as NA Reboot. You may not choose to take advantage of this, but having the option to participate in more content is a good thing. When you have 40 channels already struggling to keep up with the current player count, and then decide to limit the range of viable maps to a much more restrictive list of Starforce monsters to train on, this is what will happen. The ever so exciting gameplay of hopping all channels to finally find a map on the 27th try, and then lose it 5 minutes later when you enter a portal to do an event daily, is now pushed from higher levels to the early game. There will be 0 burning on these maps at pretty much all times. So you know those rates I described before? Scratch off the burning XP. Instead of 290,000 total XP for the regular server Grey Luxury Saucer, you now be getting about 207,000 XP. This is about 25% less than the 262,000 you were getting from the level 180 normal monster prior to the changes. Finally, it will just create more burnout because this aspect of the game will be even more repetitive than it already is. I feel like this is just another short-sighted decision that will end up worsening the player experience of new all the way through mid-game players. But who cares about them, am I right, Nexon? The next issue is the Starforce requirement itself. On regular server, you can just buy all the gear you need for a new character. In Reboot, you have to earn this gear, most of which is locked behind time-gated content, meaning daily boss clears. You only get about 80 to 90 quote-unquote free Starforce from Pencilier gear, the shoulder accessory from the Have You Learned About Potential quest, a low-level earring drop, and maybe some quest accessory items. Everything else has to come from boss drops. When every character you create has 0% drop rate, it can take several days to get the additional 6 or 7 drops needed to close the gap to 140 stars, which is the requirement for the last Starforce maps you'll go to. This requirement is made even harsher by the changes which limit the ability to trade carries. Anything less than the map requirement will result in a 30% final damage reduction, which gets even more penalized the greater the difference. Also, these mobs do a lot more damage, which is even further increased when you don't have the correct requirements. You could find yourself actually dying quite frequently on less tanky classes without an auto HP pet buff and struggling to clear the mobs quickly in the early game. When looking at a single character, I think these issues don't impact your overall playtime too much. It just spreads out the time you progress a character over multiple days, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of bosses give a good deal of XP themselves, so it can be beneficial to pop a 2x coupon, find a rune, clear the daily bosses you can, train out the rest of your coupon, then move on to something else on your account. However, when looking at multiple characters, managing this playstyle will probably contribute to the already tedious daily grind that MapleStory has. Personally, I feel like these small bursts of training are much more enjoyable than a straight grind. With the exception of burning, I don't think I've run a character straight through to 200 in a single play session before. Also, with how many events come out with extreme growth potions and training bonus rewards attached to daily tasks, you end up being encouraged to play in short bursts on each character anyway. But to my earlier point, doing this, you are narrowing the competitive training options by worsening alternatives. More choice to satisfy different playstyles is better. I mean, I'm no game developer, but off the top of my head, there are 2 paths that avoid these issues. First path is the easiest in my opinion. Rather than take away a currently better system from Reboot, apply the Reboot XP rates to the regular server from levels 1 to 200. Everyone should be happy with that, and if you're not, pull the 8-foot stick out of your ass, please and thank you. The second path, which is actually probably better for the game, is to revamp the Starforce mobbing system. I can see the benefits of Starforce mobbing as an introduction to Starforcing equipment, early bossing and questlines, and the Arcane Force system in the next part of the game. These ideas aren't tied very well together, and it needs improvement. There should be a larger variety of Starforce mobs at all level ranges. At a minimum, there needs to be options between level 180 to 200, but I think essentially all regular maps should be converted to Starforce, and there's really no point in having them. Alternatively, they can create new maps with Starforce variants across each area, but that's a long shot for Nexon, let's be real. Finally, the Starforce requirements should be re-examined for Reboot, as they are steep for how quickly you progress from 100 to 200. In summary, there are alternatives that genuinely improve the game, resolve some of the issues, and don't just piss off a large portion of the player base. These are ideas I came up with in a day. They aren't fully vetted out, but would have a widely different impact on player reception if they proposed them, then adapted them to feedback up until release, rather than just straight nerf the server. To me, Nexon appears very reactive to feedback, rather than proactively thinking of a better player experience and game design. Wow. I'm already deep into this and I haven't even looked at levels 200 and up, so let's get into that. Again, I put together a simple table which shows the arcane monster level, the reboot HP and XP multipliers, and the XP reduction from reverting back to regular server rates. All arcane monsters have the same 130% additional base XP, so it results in 57% less XP across the board. However, these are not the only changes. We are simultaneously getting an update to the experience required to level, so I've added a column showcasing that and the total percent reduction in XP after adding the two together. Again, what this looks like on paper is pretty harsh nerf to levels 200 to 240 and 260 plus. Like always, looking at it in a vacuum doesn't necessarily tell the whole picture. There are a lot of moving pieces going on here. Monster HP reductions result in earlier one-hit KOs on mobs. Dailies such as Monster Park, Arcane River quests, and event rewards are getting progressively stronger, which will give you stronger alternatives to grinding. These are all positives. But let's break it down by level range. For levels 200 to 210, I think I've only trained a character through these levels maybe twice on my account, yet I have 15 characters at level 210 or higher. This is because we get an insane amount of events that give big chunks of daily XP, and we can frequently earn free growth potion selectors, which provide 8 instant levels from 202 to 210. I think the only people significantly impacted in this level range is someone on a fresh account while off major events. For levels 210 to 240, there are a few considerations to take into account alongside the nerfed XP. First, I think not all, but most players that work through these levels are on hyperburned characters. The next hyperburning, and I'm assuming future ones as well, are going to 260 instead of 250. And let me tell you, the time saved by skipping 2/3 of the levels between 250 and 260 far outweighs any additional time spent in 210 to 240 while hyperburning. Levels start to become a slog at that point, taking several hours per level. Not having to do 2/3 of those is a big win, and it will get more players past the Arcane River, which is honestly great. The exception to hyperburned characters in this range is boss mules. Many people make boss mules from 220 to 235 for the arcane symbols. I think most people, if not already doing this, will shift to running dailies and weeklies on a character you are converting to mules rather than grinding. For players that have limited time or dislike grinding, this will give them a much more relaxed leveling experience. Also, by the time you hit the level benchmarks for the new Arcane River regions, the character will end up being much stronger because of the symbols you get throughout this process. Overall, I think the only people impacted in this level range are more hardcore players who are grinding through these levels to make more mules, or higher than AK Legion by training characters off event. Honestly, it just sucks for these people, and Nexon should be trying to retain dedicated players. Actually, it's not just these players. This has always been true, but it's even worse now for new players starting the game for the first time in an event downtime. This is just worse all around, but that's kind of its own issue. For levels 240 to 260, the XP impact is incredibly minimal. I don't really think there's much to say for this that hasn't already been said. All in all, a little bit of XP decrease, but burning to 260 is just a win for everybody. Finally, the dreaded group. For levels 260 and up, this is Nexon's double middle finger fuck you to these players. They are getting the stick, and it's not even their fault. The developers accidentally designed a more enjoyable, affordable, quicker progression game in Reboot where you don't have to take out a loan to compete at high levels. Who would have thought that a game could be designed this way? Not Nexon. People who treat this game like a 16-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job from the regular server have decided that their meaningless, paid-for accomplishments are devalued by progression rates on what is effectively a separate game. Instead of focusing on a fun, enjoyable game as its core competency, Nexon is taking the short-term corporate greed approach, dollars today for the erosion of our player base tomorrow. A phenomenal strategy that isn't really unique to Nexon, but yeah. This brings me to the final topic of the video. Why did Nexon decide to do this? In the developer notes, they mentioned that they originally set the hunting difficulty to be higher than regular worlds, while also giving higher experience rewards in order to maximize the fun of character growth. However, they've decided the Reboot players have been having a little too much fun compared to our regular server counterparts, because this viewpoint clearly no longer makes sense to them. They essentially go on to say that the power creep resulted in faster progression than intended, and that they want to align the servers to have a similar growth path. Look, I have no problem with integrity updates removing content that isn't good for the game, but my bullshit meter broke the gauge on this one. This is not an issue that came out of nowhere. There's a lot of speculation that this decision was driven by some whales in Korea switching game modes and others complaining about the disparity in XP rates. I'm inclined to believe this is the case. I mean, the Korean player base is fighting amongst themselves. Nexon didn't suddenly come to the decision that Reboot needs to be reverted to the regular server after several years of disparity. That's pretty obvious. The way Nexon chose to go about this update was horrendous. They dropped it on players out of nowhere. Nexon didn't need to nerf Reboot in this way. They could have further increased the difficulty of mobs to make it in line with their original vision. They could have buffed the regular server, which already has several faster progression items, even further. Instead, They punish players who enjoy the benefits, and I'll say it, of a better designed server. Just understand they heard the feedback of whales mad at Reboot and consciously decided to punish Reboot to appease them rather than come up with literally any other design changes. While I dislike Nexon for their decision-making process, all in all, I think the impact of the nerfs are blown out of proportion by most players. I like to think I gave a fair shake to the impacts of these changes, but most players will just modify their playstyles from levels 1 to 260, but won't see drastic changes to their progression. The vast majority of people who pick up this game haven't even made it to level 260. For the hardcore players getting to 260 and beyond, well, this blows and you don't deserve it. I'm sorry. Before I let you go, please consider doing a few things for me. First, like and subscribe. Also, I've made a Discord to help build a community around MapleStory. The link for that will be down in the description. Finally, for those of you that wish to support the channel further, I've created a Patreon. By no means should you feel obligated to donate. Just stopping by to watch the video is plenty. This option is for viewers that want to be more engaged in the content creation process, have early access to upcoming videos, and additional perks. I'll be investing earnings from this back into the channel. Thanks again, everybody.